Welcome everyone. Today's webinar is part 2 of the Sentiment Essentials series. My name is Kim Larson. I'm a Client Success Manager here at Luminoso. For those of you who are new or haven't heard of us, Luminoso was founded by a few brilliant minds out of the MIT Media Lab back in 2010 after creating our natural language understanding AI. And Daylight is our product that enables users to utilize that AI to analyze text data. We have a team in the chat, myself included, who are looking for your questions, comments, general feedback. We're happy to see it. And we're setting aside time to answer your questions at the end. Today, I'm excited to be joined by Rob and James here of MAi Research and Pathfinder Analytics. As longtime Luminoso clients and Daylight users, Rob and James, would you go ahead and introduce yourselves?
Sure. My name is Rob Pascale. I'm President and Chief Analytics Officer of MAi Research and founder of our sister company, Pathfinder Analytics. We've been a client of Luminoso for about 10 years now, and over that time, we've continuously pushed the envelope of what's possible with text analysis in an area that we call text science. And by pairing the power of Luminoso's engine through their API, with our machine learning approaches and custom derived measures, we've enabled our clients to understand and act on their essential stories. And I'm joined here with one of my colleagues, James. You want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm James Cameron, Director of Creative Insights with MAi Pathfinder. And I've been working with Rob, like you said, for about 10 years or more on text analytics with Luminoso. And we got into this because we were looking for an alternative to coding survey open-ends. But as we've learned how useful the technique is and what can be done with it, we've been doing more and more with it, including using not just survey data, but online consumer reviews, social media data, call center data, really anywhere we can grab enough text. And what we've found is that Luminoso makes it so easy, particularly when it comes to revealing the sentiment that people are using, whatever they're talking about. Are they being positive or negative or neutral about it? And that's really what this and the other 2 webinars in the series are about.
Thanks. That's a good summary. And thank you both for being here today. In today's webinar, our audience will be learning how to break down sentiment findings for their own audiences. So if any members in the audience need help, please use our chat function. And today, Rob will break down the fundamentals, the ways that Pathfinder graphs polarization and net sentiment. James will be bridging those fundamentals with a real data example that we have, and I'll go over the role that Luminoso's Daylight plays in doing that work. But first, let's review the key parts from part 1 that we'll be referencing today. We know that for a successful sentiment analysis, we need to pick quality, storyful data sources like we have outlined on the left here. The data James will be going over in a little bit will be player experience feedback. Those are scraped Steam reviews for the No Man's Sky game. And don't worry, we won't get too into the details about this game yet because we're going to be doing a more complete breakdown of that on January 10th. That's when we'll talk about, and spoiler warning for January, how essential it is for organizations to, 1, care about their base, whether it's players, consumers, guests, employees, constituents, whoever, and 2, to continuously listen and respond appropriately, informed by that feedback. No guessing required. So in our last episode of Sentiment Essentials, we defined sentimental, sentimentful, and we're focusing today on polarization and net sentiment, those calculation bits. Pathfinder has utilized polarization and net sentiment longer than anyone else. They've been using it for a while. So with that, I will pass the mic to Rob, who will show us the visualization we'll be utilizing today.
Sure. So I'll start by breaking down how we look at the derived measures that we talked about last time. So for each concept that's in the Luminoso map, the galaxy map, we start by pulling out the polarized pairs shown on the y-axis here. This is where we are detecting the size of the tug of war around a concept. So the more it is pulled to the positive and negative, the more polarizing, and then the higher up on this chart it'll be. After pulling out the pairs of positives and negatives, we're left with the net sentiment. And so that's shown here on the x-axis. If the net balance is negative, it's going to be on the left-hand side. And if it's positive, it's going to be on the right-hand side. The center where the axes intersect is where we would see things like statements of fact, something with 0% polarization and 0 net sentiment. And the entire purpose of this, again, seems very simplistic, but it allows us to highlight specific concepts that we expect to provide insight into the topic we're analyzing, and ultimately find where the story lies, which is an important part of this whole process, but do it very quickly. So I'll go through a few examples here. When there's perfect disagreement about a topic, then we'll have 50% positive and 50% negative. We're going to end up with polarization at 100%. So net sentiment will be 0, polarization ends up at 100, and the term ends up on the y-axis all the way up at the top. It's worth mentioning that the polarizing terms are not necessarily to be avoided in communications, but you need to learn more about them, because it could just be that they're surfacing strong preferences that people are expressing through their text. And so you'd really want to dig into the raw text associated with the terms so that you can understand how to tap into the positive aspects and avoid any negative pitfalls. When everyone agrees on the concept being positive or negative, there's no disagreement, so no polarization. And the term will end up on the x-axis. If it's universally disliked, like toxic waste here, it'll be on the far left of this chart. If it's universally liked, like getting a raise, it will be on the far right of this chart. But in reality, 100% polarization or 100% net sentiment in either direction is pretty rare. There's usually some amount of polarization related to a concept, regardless of how good or bad it is. And again, this type of chart helps to quickly highlight the terms that we should be digging into and include into our other text science analytics. And so going back to the No Man's Sky data.
I'll grab it from there. Thanks, Rob. And so for those of us who aren't gamers, I want to give our audience some additional context about the game using what we use in Daylight by looking at what the players have said about the game. And we want to do that using one of our Daylight features, Galaxy. So Galaxy is a feature in Daylight that shows the relatedness of terms geographically and by color bleed. We see at the bottom there in the yellow section, Galaxy is related to planet, and hype at the top is related to promised and developers and some emotion terms around there. Galaxy also uses font size to communicate prevalence. So we covered that in part 1 with the pedestrians, unicorns example. One is more common than the other and therefore more interesting. So this surfaces what is interesting and mentioned in this data set. So seeing the related terms here and knowing how the interface works, even without knowing much about the data myself, because I'm not a gamer, I can still get the gist of what the reviews are saying. This is a game by developers, there's a multiplayer setting, there's emotions around that. It exists in this planet universe with creatures, there's mechanics and features, there's flying. And then we get to the upgrade section with the bugs and crashes back to developers. So we get this nice kind of narrative wheel of what's going on in the data. And interestingly, I can see potentially ambiguous language identified by the AI correctly. So in red, we see bugs, but bugs could easily have been associated with planet and creatures. The AI identified, oh, bugs in this context are associated with fix and crashes in PC. So good job, robot AI, figuring out what bugs are. Let's see what that AI found regarding the concept sentiment. So in this is the Daylight sentiment view for some of those concepts like planet and galaxy, etc. Daylight automates the mundane work of reading those thousands of gamer reviews, and that allows analysts like Rob and James here to jump to the answers. However, robot does its robot best. It will surface anything you ask for, but not all of these concepts are interesting in sentiment. So I'll pass the mic to James. Which of these concepts makes the most sense to prioritize in sentiment and why?
Well, all of them could be interesting to explore further. So for example, bugs, crashes, third from the bottom, that's an important concept to look at from developing from the developer standpoint. So how do you improve the game? This is going to pinpoint areas where players are having instability issues, but it's almost entirely negative sentiment. So from a sentiment perspective, there's not really much there. But some of these concepts, the ones that we've marked in purple, do jump out as being quite interesting in terms of the sentiment that gamers have around them. So take exploration, for example. It's a key feature of the game and one of the main selling points. You can look at the cover and it's got vistas and spaceships and aliens and mountains and all kinds of cool things. So looking at the sentiment that gamers have around this concept is going to help us understand how well the game delivered on the promise of exploration. Now, expectation, right below that, this is a really fascinating one because this game had a difficult launch. It wasn't quite up to speed when it was released. And in particular, there was a big contrast between what the game developers were promising and what they ended up delivering at launch. So we see this concept of promise and expectations as a really important one in the data set. And looking at the sentiment around it will help us understand how gamers reacted to the less than ideal launch. And then below that, we've got multiplayer co-op. Now, this is was a key feature, again, that was promised and was not quite delivered initially. In some platforms, it was missing entirely. In some cases, it just wasn't stable or it wasn't offering the type of multiplayer experience that gamers wanted. So this is another one. It's an important part of what the game was promising. And by looking at the sentiment, we can see how well it delivered. So let's measure the intensity of the sentiment and see how these three elements fared. So we can see that exploration is clearly well received. It's got a net positive sentiment plus 43. This is one of the bright spots for the game and the reaction that gamers had to it. So you could say that they did pretty good here. The expectations they did not do quite as well there. The game did not meet expectations. We can see there's a lot of sentiment around it, but much of it is polarizing. So you got a very high polarization score of 64%. And then beyond that, there's a net negative sentiment of negative 25%. So these are not good marks to look at. Clearly, the expectations that the game developers created, well, they led to a lot of disappointment on the part of the gamers themselves. On multiplayer co-op, what we see here is a really high polarization score, 78% polarization. A little bit of a nudge into the positive sentiment, but only 4 percentage points. So what we're looking at with multiplayer is it's a dimension, a feature that was important. They can't really be said to have delivered on it, at least not to the satisfaction of many of the people who bought the game. Now, if we take these numbers and plot them into the Pathfinder graph that Rob was going through a little bit earlier, we see almost kind of a map, a sentiment map of these concepts and how they perform in the data set. You can see expectations on the upper left in red. So this is a negative and fairly polarizing concept. The top polarizing is at the top, multiplayer. You can see a really high polarization. So there's just a huge clash going on there between people who really liked it, people who did not like it. And then on the right, we have exploration, the most positive of the ones that we were looking at. A feature that they delivered well on. To the right of that, on the far right, we have relaxing. So we added a couple others here to kind of fill out the graph. Relaxing is almost entirely positive, very little negative or polarization here. So people who are describing the game being relaxing are using really positive language. The opposite of that on the left is boring, which is almost entirely negative 92% sentiment. So, and curiously, relaxing and boring are both kind of low energy feelings, and yet we're seeing a huge divide in sentiment between if you bore the player, it's the worst thing that you could be doing. It's really not good. But if you can get them to relax, That's what they're looking for. That makes them happy. And in the middle, we have RAM, which is the most neutral of these. It's just a little bit above the neutral axis. So it's basically a statement of fact. And that's it. It's really just a simple display of some pretty complex sentiment analysis on this chart.
Thanks, James. One thing I'll point out while we're still on this slide is it's a sentiment breakdown, right? So we can't see the frequency of how often boring is mentioned or how often relaxing is mentioned. It's a two-dimensional sentiment graph, so I think hopefully we get some questions about that. This was a more concise kind of presentation than I think part 1 or part 3 will be, because we want to make sure that since this is more calculations based than story based, that we are able to answer all of your questions. So I think I will defer to my fellow client success manager here at Luminoso. John, will you chime in and be our questions moderator? See if we have John.
We're waiting for John to come on. Just real quick, I just want to mention that a lot of times when we're doing these sentiment maps, these charts, there's a lot of terms on them. This is a very simplistic view for this particular example.
Yep. All right, and John, are you doing just audio?
I'm trying to put the webcam on, and here we go. Hi, everyone. Cool. So yeah, first question from the audience. We've got one fielding from, here we go. How can I know whether I should put effort into shifting polarizing concepts into the net positive bucket?
Rob, do you want to take this one?
Sure. So in other words, taking something that is currently polarizing and then deciding whether you want to message against it to push it more positive, I'm assuming. In that case, you really need to do more research into the facets of that thing that you want to sway. So it may be swayable, it may not. If it's swayable, then it would come down to messaging or maybe product development. But if it's not, you may want to avoid it altogether. It may not be worth really putting a lot of effort behind it. In other cases, you might want to address a non-swayable thing head on. You might want to just own it. It depends really on what it is. And then you have to decide whether you want to really put effort behind it, whether it's, it might be something very expensive to fix, or it might be something that is going to be very expensive to get the word out and correct the story that you want to tell. It depends on what the ROI is there and what you expect in return for that. And in regards to the other research, you might, when you're breaking it down to the other facets, you might want to do something that's more survey-based, where you can probe into certain areas that you may learn from the text. I hope that answers it. James, do you have anything else you might want to add to that?
Yeah, one other point I would make is that it's fairly easy to at least kind of take the temperature of a polarizing concept by going back to the verbatims and seeing what the respondents or the reviewers are actually saying. So one of our principles is whenever we do so much number crunching and we do a lot of quantifying this data, but we make a point of never being too far away from the actual text itself, what our respondents or what the reviewers said, what their unfiltered thoughts were. So when something like this comes up, you can always dip into that, take 5 minutes, read some of those, and it's amazing how quickly you can get up to speed on why something might be polarizing or not, just by, well, doing what this is all about, is listening to the voice of the customer. So dig into those verbatims.
And I'll chime in on that, since I said I would play the role of what role does Daylight play in it. One of the things that Daylight does is it prioritizes the verbatims that it thinks is most relevant to a given concept or a given topic. So depending on how a person is describing something, for example, we may be looking into multiplayer here, but if someone's writing in the review, I play with my friends and I got to log in and I can't access, the way they describe it, even if they're not mentioning multiplayer explicitly, Daylight does make reading that a lot easier, versus if you're reading all of the verbatims by hand, you may miss that whole story. So a little bit of a plug. If you're going to read it, at least read it smartly. I struggle seeing folks go through it the hard way.
Especially when, 10,000 records in this data set.
Yeah.
So if you're looking at something like multiplayer with hundreds or thousands of mentions, yeah, you could spend days reading through it. So Daylight is tremendously helpful in speeding that up. Absolutely.
So we appreciate it, and apologies for the plug, but if you're going to read it manual, at least do it strategically. John, what's our next question?
We got another question about how do I tell whether net extreme is actually driving behavior?
Ooh, pick me, because I see this a lot. It's a great question. We actually have another version of this sentiment chart that we dropped into the appendix because we weren't sure whether or not we should include it. Yeah, let's jump to that. So this is a sentiment chart for general things that maybe resonate more for our non-gamer audience, such as myself, where something that like long receipts with coupons, I think is a good thing. Like people may appreciate the coupons. Some people are like, I'm not going to use the coupons, save the paper. It's just going to take up more space in my car floor area. And we want to make sure that we're using this paired with drivers or some sort of quantifiable analysis. In the first webinar, we covered the importance of metadata. In some of the data we've seen, there are some very positive things in the data associated with low driver scores, because people are mentioning, I don't like X, I don't like Y, I only buy because, or I'm only here because of this one element. So when you pair this with drivers, if you pair this with matching frequency, you really can get a lot out of it. So you don't want to necessarily take sentiment as the driving course. You want to make sure that you're being thoughtful and taking the full picture into account. Because free drink for your birthday, if it's only being given to 2 people a year because they're friends with the barista, that's going to have a different driver element than if it's given to everybody. So things to keep in mind. Rob, do you want to expand on that a little bit?
You mentioned about drivers, so definitely want to chime in. So Luminoso has that built-in driver mechanic through Galaxy, through Daylight, which is great. But we've also got a machine learning approach where we are able to combine the text back with that closed-ended information that I've mentioned a couple of times over last session and this one, that we call driver pathways. It's a more comprehensive approach to understanding how all of the data interconnects, and you can actually see and quantify all of the chains of drivers throughout the entire data set. It's pretty neat because you get to see how attribute ratings, attitudes, behaviors, anything else in the data set connects back to the actual words that people use to describe either behaviors or usage occasions or experiences with brands. It's pretty cool.
I will confirm it's pretty neat, but I'll also assert it is a varsity level. If you need to understand every element of your data set, that is exactly when you want to need it, or when you need it, when you want it. Yes, we've seen it and appreciate it. Other questions?
Yeah, we've got another one also about metrics. So what other text-based metrics are there besides net sentiment and polarity?
I can take this one. So besides net sentiment and polarization, we've created a couple of other scores. We've got an emphasis score, which is based off of prevalence. It's got some other things built into it. We've got sentiment purity scores, disagreement scores, and a bunch of other different data transformations that we use in our driver pathways process.
Yeah, and we will recognize that this was the sentiment essentials class. If you want the sentiment varsity class, talk to Rob and James. Yeah, I think
for essentials for us.
They are the essentials for you. But for, I think, many use cases, this kind of plot is already taking folks beyond what they're already covering. So this is going to be a flex for quite a few folks, I think. Any other questions? It's a little bit of a light group, so if you want, we can jump to our Easter egg and
Sure.
go to that. So that is, I'll take it because I planted the Easter egg and made the reference. One of the questions that we anticipated getting is, does Luminoso have a polarization and net sentiment visualization in daylight? And I would say there's lots of ways to visualize it. We displayed one of the basic ways, but we know that there's many ways to convey it. We're looking for those levels of innovation with our partners and our clients. And this is another way that MAi and Pathfinder, Rob and James have figured out how to convey that polarization, net sentiment visualization using the daylight science. So Rob's already sharing. Rob, do you want to share what you're showing us?
Sure. So this takes a little bit of explanation, but not too much. So we mentioned how we use the Luminoso backend to create all these different things. And so far we've covered only the basics of what we've done, or breaking apart sentiment. But what you see here is the map of that No Man's Sky data, the way that we would present it to one of our clients. Except this time it's opened up in what we call an interactive concept cloud. And this is something we developed and deliver standard with our tech science. It's stored completely offline, usually within our reports, but it opens up in a web browser. And you can do things like drag it around and zoom and things like that, which makes it a great presentation tool. But this was actually designed by us to be used as a research tool. And so when you hover over a term, you can see the match count, the sentiment, net sentiment. So in this case, features has a -22, and then polarization 53. But you can also click on a term and you see that it changes to a heat map coloration. So you can see how associated all of the other terms are on the map with the one that you click. And then you can also see the raw verbatims tied to the term that you clicked. And so it makes it a really great way to really dig into all the text here. And so this allows us to actually, we've heard clients call it a focus group frozen in time before. But one of the other things, so right now you're seeing all the theme colors, but one of the other things we can do is switch over to sentiment mode. And here you can see that everything that is in bright green is very strongly net positive. Everything in bright red is strongly net negative. And then everything that's in bright blue is strongly polarizing. And so you can see like developers here, 87% polarizing, -6% net sentiment. Boring, -92% net sentiment, 3% polarization. And anything that's neutral becomes more transparent. And so it fades out in this mode, since we're focusing on what is the core of the sentiment within the text. And so this winds up being a really great tool for being able to get to what you really need and what you want to focus on very, very quickly.
It's a very analyst-friendly visualization. So if folks really are leaning into the exploration, really wanting to explore every nook and cranny of their data, it's a neat resource. Cool.
Yeah.
So last call for questions. Otherwise, we may have a short webinar today. And we're always welcoming to questions. And if you want to reach out to us afterwards privately with specific data, we are happy to review that with you, for you, etc. So with that, I think that covers all the questions. Thank you all for giving us your time. We hope you found it valuable and insightful. Don't hesitate to reach out, and we're happy to help tackle any of your market research or text analysis questions. All recordings will be posted to our YouTube channel, along with contact information for Luminoso and MAi Research. We'll also be including registration links for the webinar at the end of the month, which should be bridging. So you have the data, how do you package that into a story for stakeholders in a way that stakeholders will resonate with, do something with, and you're not just throwing spaghetti at a wall, so to speak. In December, we have a webinar with Luminoso CER, Jeff Moyer, who will be covering the benefits and challenges to integrating AI into your business operations. If you haven't utilized an AI in your operations before, there's unique challenges to that. And in January, as we hinted to earlier in the webinar, we'll have Rob and James back to explore this data, covering the importance of listening and acting on feedback from your customers, stakeholders, employees, etc. So thank you again, Rob and James. Thank you, John, for hosting our Q&A.
Thank you.
We hope everyone has a great afternoon. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.